Today we're going to continue to learn Symfony 4, and this time we're going to talk about Doctrine ORM, which stands for Object Relational Mapping, I guess. So we go to the folder of some projects which I used before, and to use Doctrine we're going to need to install Doctrine ORM component, which is a standalone library to be used for when it comes to database management. So we install Doctrine with Composer, and we're also gonna need a Maker to generate some classes automatically. Maker can, for example, generate entity or like controller. So I'm going to use Android for this tutorial. I'm going to show you that Android is enough for development. PHP with the Symfony framework. As a database, we're going to use MariaDB. It's a MySQL fork for Android. And as a PHP, we're going to use PHP 7, which is installable from Termux. So now I'm going to edit in file which contains database settings, and MariaDB uses root as a username and blank passwords, which they say is not safe, but this doesn't need security because it's just a database running on a mobile device. Nobody really needs to hack things like that, I guess, because there is nothing to hack. So the database that will be used is Symfony. It's going to be created once we work with Symfony to always use that database. So now I'm going to start in command line a script which is named console, and Doctrine running from command line, which allows us create database. So it will read .env file and generate a database if there is a database with all the permissions needed for that. So now it says that it couldn't generate that. It's because I don't have MySQL database running on this machine. So I need to install it. So I go to Play Store. If you're in places like Crimea, you might not be able to use Play Store, so you go to APK Monk or some other store like 7 Store, whatever, so you can install MariaDB, or perhaps there is also alternative, I don't know. So I'm going to install MariaDB as I do with all the apps from the Play Store. I need to accept some requirements and jump through payment settings. So once MariaDB is installed, I'll execute that and it will give me options of the versions of it. So nice thing about this app is that you could use older version if for some reason you don't like update. But I'm going to install the most recent one and execute it. It doesn't need requirements. It just creates a user with name root and with no passwords. So I open up the MariaDB, which is my local MySQL server, and I start MySQL server. Now I can repeat that command, and that command should create database according to .env file. So I successfully created a database with name symfdb, and now I'm going to use commands that make. That's why I installed maker actually, and it allows me to create entity or controller. And this time I'm going to use it to create entity first. And the entity class, it's an abstraction class which you create. It contains an object. In this case, the class is product, and this product will contain variables which will refer to real fields in the table. So entity is actually abstraction from table in database, and all the fields in there are the variables of this class, so the properties. So you create this product class. It was automatically generated with ID, so the minimum requirements for the class to function, entity to work. We can add any variables, and by default we use annotations to specify the type of the variable. So it could be text, it could be a number. In this case, ID is integer, and for the price we could use integer or numeric, and for the rest of the field like name and description, I would use text as a type. So I create annotation for another variable. So I need to write add ORM column, and then I specify the type of the variable. You can just copy paste things like this, not write them manually from the documentation, or if you use IDE, it could generate some piece of the code for you, like PHP Storm could generate setters and getters and annotations. So I'm going to use type decimal, and because the price could be a big number, I need to scale it. Scale 2 should be enough. And now I'm going to create a price property, and of course it's allowed to be nullable. Unfortunately, in real life there are not many products which have no price, but it must be allowed if price is not specified. So this is the annotation which is required to create a field in the database, and it's going to be private price. Because all the properties are private, to modify them we will need to create setters and getters, and here when the ID could be used, like PHP Storm or Eclipse. Because I don't use ID, I just use vEditor. I'll have to create all those setters and getters myself. Well, now I just save this entity, and I'm going to run it against the real database. So I use console again, and I type Doctrine, and to really execute this, first we need to create SQL command which would do the job, which is a file which contains differences between the real database and our entity. So it has generated that migration, which file name is version 2007-1231. And in this class it contains this time create table. If it was not the first time we would execute this. If we would make a change, it would be not create but update. So Symfony, well, Doctrine knows what kind of SQL statement it needs, either create if it's first time or update if it is modification of the existing table, so forth. So you don't have to bother writing SQL statements when you have Doctrine. So now we create a controller product. So make is able to create a controller class which will be already usable. Of course, we need to make some modifications to use it for our project. In our file, we're going to edit it. It is in source folder, where there is a folder controller and then product controller. Once we open this file, we see that it was already generated with the annotation product, but we want to pass to this class from URL values which we want to be stored in the database. That's how it usually works. So you need some values to save them into database, right? So now it's time to decide in which order and which values are needed to be passed to this class. And if we want variables to be passed, we put them into brackets, curly brackets. So the first one is a name, then we want the next variable to be specified. I'm struggling with the Android keyboard for this thing, so I should really use Bluetooth keyboard. So description, the second value which we want to read from URL, and the third value is going to be price. And once we set those values, we're going to need to read them in our controller, which is the index method of the controller class. So 15 years ago I moved from Windows to Linux. I never looked back. I had some projects with Windows and with Mac as a network administrator or developer, but I never used Windows privately after that. So I was in Linux for all these years, and now it's time to move to Android because of several reasons. First of all, which is mobility. And number of apps and all the functionality of Android, starting from Android 5, is incredible. So you can do actually anything what you can do on Linux machine, you can do it today on Android. And as you can see, you can even make Symfony development, including database management. So now we create product objects, and we need to use setters to set the values of those variables. We didn't create setters yet, so we have to go back to entity and create setters and getters for every variable we have there. And we didn't create many variables yet. I guess we want to create a name. So we make set name. We'll have to create this setter later. And as I said, in IDE like Eclipse or PHP Storm, you could have those setters and getters generated automatically, but we don't have that luxury yet in the Android. Perhaps there is some IDE for Android as well which does that job. If you really know one, please let me know. And when it comes to real development, of course I'm using IDE like PHP Storm or any other. Well, I personally prefer open source like Eclipse, but it can be anything. And these values, name and description and price, will be read from the URL when you execute this in your browser. So I'm going to copy this line, and for that purpose I press 2 times D in V, and it erases all the line. And then I undo this pressing U, and then I paste it from the clipboard with a P. Now I'm going to modify, so I don't need to write the whole thing. because this keyboard is really pain when it comes to those PHP symbols like dash, more than, or $sign. You have to press, you have to switch to numeric mode in your keyboard to input those characters. So now I need to persist these values, I guess, to record them to real database, to run this SQL statement which will be generated, insert statement in this case, to save those values. And Doctrine allows our project to be functional without manual SQL writing, and SQL can be pain, so you can make some mistakes, you can confuse something. So it's much better to use these kind of tools, and all the abstraction entity as a data structure to not to mess with the SQL, to be aligned. So it will return some text, and we don't need text welcome to your controller. We want the text like it successfully created the value. And we're going to need ID to know which record was created, and for that purpose we need a getter for ID variable. So it's a product object and get ID. Yeah, it's really slow when it comes to keyboard like this, but in the real development, when you use Bluetooth keyboard, it's gonna be as smooth as developing on any desktop or laptop. So I save the file, and now I'm going to edit the entity. So I need some more variables. We only have ID and price. So I'm going to use name and description, and I'm going to copy this and paste it and just modify. So the reason why I decided to move completely to Android is because of mobility. The very first reason, because imagine you can have all your projects and all your communication, or all the things you normally do in computer, you can have them on your phone. You can come home, connect your phone to Bluetooth or a normal TV via adapter, connect keyboard, Bluetooth keyboard, and it will function like a docking station. So you come home, you make some development, or I don't know, communication, email checking, and watch films perhaps. Then you just disconnect it and take it with you and continue your work or whatever you do. So it's really making you mobile, and this is the future, I think. Once you have a Linux machine in your pocket, you'll never want to carry a backpack with a laptop, I guess. All people are different, but depends on the level of mobility you have. When you have this kind of travel, that because of the train delay or plane delay, you may stay some nights in the airport, on a train station, or these kind of problems, you don't really want to carry a laptop with its charging problem. With the phone you can have a charging device, how they call that, charging bank, or you can plug it into any USB charger, or in the bus, or in the whatever it is. So it's really convenient to have a mobile device instead of a laptop. And now we finally have it with the Android starting from 5, where you can install Termux and all the other stuff like PHP, Golang, MySQL database, so whatever you want to use. So it didn't work because I have price variable twice in the entity. So go back to the entity, and I need to remove one of them. So I remove one extra, and then I need to execute this again. So the diff creates SQL statement with differences, and then I migrate. Once I save that, I know that this data already is stored in the, so we modify the table. This time MySQL statement is update, and it created new fields like name and description, and now I have to manually create setters and getters. That's the pain which you can avoid when you have IDE. So if you really have many properties in your entity class and you want setters and getters to be generated, you can just do it once in IDE like Eclipse, and I guess Android Studio can do that. So you just copy this entity to your development tool, and then generate getters and setters and copy it back to your device. That could be a solution. Or just keep on developing. I'm not really encouraging everybody to run Symfony development or other type of development in the Android device. I'm just showing that it's really doable today. It's one of the options. I'm still bound to some working place unless it's completely independent freelance development. Normally it's not, so you have a computer from your work and you develop on that device. But you can actually have the stuff to check or to try or to develop on your vacation or on your free time. You can have it in parallel. Like in this case, for example, I now develop a tutorial project which uses Doctrine, and once I develop something, I could just copy the entity which I have here to another Symfony project and run all those commands to migrate from that entity to real database. And in this case I use MySQL, but MySQL PDO is so the MySQL driver for PDO is supported by PHP in Termux recently. So if you have PHP installed long ago and now it doesn't work, just install PHP once again. I didn't have to bother it, I didn't have to configure it, I just had to install new PHP. Interestingly, that in a few days they made support for MySQL. So before it was only SQLite. So it started from SQLite because I guess they thought for Android device it's more important to have SQLite, but now for MySQL and Mongo support, and it's still developing, so I'm very excited and very pleased with new developments. So I'm creating some setters and getters for every property we have. The properties are private, so you cannot modify them when you create an object from this class externally. So that's why you have setters and getters. This is how it's usually done. Theoretically, you could make them public and just set them externally, but this is not how it's done in Symfony. Symfony 4 became really completely object-oriented and really good practices I used. So the previous versions like Symfony 2 or Symfony 1, they just had the jobs done, but now they do it in really incorrect way, which is, and this is really different from what it was. But that's why I'm so interested in Symfony 4, because it's completely new approach to many things like entity. What we have here to create a database, we just modify .env file. We put settings for the database. Then we run Doctrine in command line and create that database. Then to create a table in that database, we just create entity again in command line. It creates entity with ID, and then you can add your properties, and then you again in command line execute that, and it creates the table which you need, and then from the code, from the controller, it inserts data when you create an object from that entity class. So it's really straightforward and really short. In Symfony 3, for example, just recently you had to make other steps. You had to modify more config files for the database. There were three actually config files you have to modify. Now you don't need to do that. So it's really good development, which really removes some configuration routine from development. Symfony does it for you. All you need is just to first to execute from command line, and then in your controller you execute you create the object, set the values, and run it against the database. Well, to execute server conveniently, because now it runs in the folder of blog, which is my other project which I used in the previous tutorial. Now I'm going to modify the PHP executing script and it is one level lower than home directory in the user bin folder, and we need to modify it to run in our current project, not the project we had before. That's why I remove block and put my project, which is the name of the project I'm currently working on. So Symfony will complain, but it's really explanatory and we can fix all the things we need. So it's product, and then we specify the name of the product, and let's specify the price, and the description. Yeah, post could be used for this execution, and with Ajax you can actually submit data without running URL, without putting in the values in URL. But for now, for simplicity, we just read them from URL. So Symfony complained that we can't use entity because it's a different namespace. So I put use this entity so I could create the object from that class. Otherwise, it couldn't just see it. So now it should successfully create that class, but there is other error. Yeah, we didn't specify the in controller index function. We didn't put give parameters into that methods. So all those three, name, value, and price, we don't have them in this methods. We should specify them as parameters. So I put variables name and description and price, and then we can use them in our code. in this case to assign the values for the object of entity. So let's give it a shot. And once we execute this time it says wrong value. So because one of the values should be numeric, and we probably try to assign the text to numeric value. So I'm going to replace the positions, but this is, well, we first had price, I guess, in our entity. So let's put price in the beginning. But in here actually it doesn't matter in which order we assign values to objects. Important is in which order they come in as parameters to the methods. So we want first to have price, then we want to have description, and then the name. So we also have to specify in that order to our function. Or let's have price and name and description. So you need to make sure they fall in the same order everywhere and in URL, because we send them as URL parameters. And when it comes to numeric values, there must be some kind of validation, which Symfony actually does here, but for production you will not see that message, so it will be just failure with no error message once you run this kind of code without decent validation logic. So we have price, then name, then description. So now it says it saved it. So we already know that these values are already in the database. But to make sure that they are really stored in the database, to see them, we can use command line Doctrine, which allows us to execute SQL statements. To see that we have those values in the table, actually that value, the first one we only did, we need to execute Doctrine in the console. So Doctrine query SQL, and the SQL statement will be select all from products. With that statement we should see the result if we have something in the product table, and if we see, then our project saves data from URL directly to the database.